We are in Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, you can open your Bibles. That will be in about verse 12 when we start back into the text itself. Thank Ed for teaching the class for me on the Wednesday while I was away. It's been a little while actually since we've been in the class because he did that on the Wednesday I was gone. Then we didn't do the normal class last Sunday while I was away, and then we had singing night last Wednesday night, and so we've been kind of away from the study. I have anyway for a couple of weeks, and you all have for about a week and a half. And I was able to actually listen and hear the study from when Ed taught it, and so I was able to stay up with the discussions and things that were going on during that time period. And Ed took you through this first, took you through the end of chapter 11 and took you through this first part of Mark chapter 12. And basically, what's the discussion going on between Jesus and those Pharisees and folks that have gathered there in the first 11 or 12 verses of chapter 12? What parable does he use to illustrate something to them? Right. And he sent what? Servants. Yeah, he sent servants, and then ultimately he sends his son, and all of them get rejected. What's the implication of all that?
He sent us prophets, he sent us son.
Yeah, okay.
This is his prophecy of his death.
Yeah, he's talking about the fact that I'm the son in the parable. I'm the son in the story. God has sent His own Son in order to bring benefit to you, but you have rejected me. You have created difficulties for me, and ultimately they'll seek to kill Him. In fact, if you go into the text and look at verse 12 of the narrative, you'll see, I'm in Psalm 1 for a reason. Only Randy Hayes knows right now why that is. And if you looked at your bulletin, you'll know why I was there for a moment this morning. Sometimes you don't just trust, you need to verify. And so if you're looking in your bulletin and trying to find Job 43 in your Bible, I have not created a new translation. I was just quickly doing the bulletin and threw the next chapter in, but forgot to verify this week, and there is no chapter 43 in the book of Job. And so our reading that'll come during the announcements will actually be from Psalm 1. But anyway, here we are in Mark chapter 12 and verse 12. They sought to lay hold on Him after this conversation, after He basically tells them, you've rejected the Son of God, and they sought to lay hold on Him, but feared the people, for they knew that He had spoken the parable against them, and they left Him and went their way. Now what's interesting about this to me is in this moment they're afraid of the people, but it won't take them very many days to do what with the people? Change their minds and get them into a pretty feverish pitch, right? They are ultimately going to be able to persuade a large enough number of folks who have gathered there in Jerusalem to completely sway the mindset of the people. But in this early stages, there's still enough popularity among Jesus that they're not really sure whether this is the right time to go lay hold on Him. And then that kind of sets up the next three scenes, if you will, in the chapter. Because from that point forward, they're going to send folks to try to do what? Catch Him in what? Yeah. Right. Something that they can accuse Him of, right? They're going to try to do something that they'll be able to accuse Jesus, sway the mindset of the people, and turn this tide in their favor. Right now, they're losing. And really, when you see these three moments here that come after verse 12, they lose in each of these as well. And they're going to ultimately have to just kind of trump up a charge of blasphemy, use some kind of false context in order to kind of push that thought through, in order to change the mindset of the multitude. But at this stage, He's dealing with them step by step, and they begin the process of coming and bringing varying kinds of questions, hoping that maybe they can trip Him up, get Him to say something that they can have a legitimate reason to bring a charge against Jesus. So in verse 13, they send unto Him certain of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to catch Him in His words. Who are the Herodians, by the way? Yes, these folks are Jewish sympathizers to the lineage of Herod, from Herod Antipas to Herod the Great. All of those line of kings These are the folks who kind of thought our livelihoods, our longevity is dependent upon staying favorable in the eyes of the Herods, and they needed to stay favorable into the eyes of who? Into Caesar, right? To Rome. So the Herods had to stay in the good graces of Rome, and this body or sect of the Jews felt like they needed to stay in good terms with the Herods so that they in turn could stay in tune with the Romans as well. Now, why I mention that is that in some senses, my conclusion is this is an interesting pairing. Because the Pharisees would probably, when it comes to Rome, want them what? Out, right? They're the lawyers of the day. They're the ones who want to dictate and determine how the law was measured and used among the Jewish people. And so they're not in favor of the Roman eyes always watching them and having to go to the Roman powers to get certain things done. They would just assume Rome be gone. The Herodians have actually attached themselves to the Roman system by their allegiances to the Herods and hope that that would give them a certain level of prominence and ability to have some influence in Judea. So my simple point is that it's an interesting pairing. These guys, when it comes to Rome, are kind of on the opposite ends of the spectrum, and yet they've joined forces because they have one what? One common enemy in their minds. By the way, historically, that happens a lot. Sometimes people will completely forget about their drastically different viewpoints on a multitude of things because they have found one common problem that they've deemed to be a problem, and they'll unify simply to try to eradicate that singular problem, and they'll join forces with just about anybody in order to accomplish that. That concept hasn't changed. We see it historically now. We've seen it in our past. We'll see it in our future. That's kind of common to the historical fabric of mankind, where it becomes a single problem in the minds of a certain, and they'll join forces with just about anybody. So here they come, the Pharisees and the Herodians, and Mark records very, very blatantly for us here that they come to catch him in his what? In his words. I find that also compelling, by the way. Was there anything wrong with what Jesus was doing? No. Okay. Could you find anything wrong with feeding thousands of people when they were hungry? Could you find anything wrong with helping a lame man walk or a blind man see? There was nothing that Jesus was doing in terms of his works and actions that would have been of any compelling reason. I mean, how are you going to go and convince a group of people that a man who can feed thousands with so little needs to be done away with? So they're not trying to trap him in what he's doing. They're trying to trap him in something that he's going to say. If we can trap him in his words, some response, something that sounds out of the norm or against the law in relationship to the questions that they raise.
They can see they're losing their prominence in the people.
Yeah.
They can't stand it.
And so they've got to find something they can say to the people. Did you hear what he said? And so they're searching. And so they've got to ask in their minds the right questions to get him to say that. And so in many senses, they're convinced in a series of events here, we've got the right kinds of questions. So they come, verse 14, and they say unto him, and notice the language. They say, Master, we know that thou art true. I have bounced, by the way, back and forth on this. I don't know. My gut says this is insincere. My gut wants to say because they're trying to trap him, because this is an illusion in order that he might say something that they could use against him. My thought wants to go to the idea that they're kind of endearing themselves to him. And when somebody endears themselves to you, you kind of do what with your guard? Yeah, you drop it, right? You kind of let your guard down. And so that's what I see, really, is that they're endearing themselves to him in hopes that he'll kind of lower his level of protection, if you will, against the things But on the other hand, it's quite possible that they kind of know that they don't really have any real argument against him. And so I suppose there's a possibility here that you're dealing with folks who know that in a legitimate debate, he's been true, and he's been honest, and he's been upright throughout it all. And so you might be able to see that in varying ways. I lean to the first. Mm-hmm.
To me, it's purely entrapment, because they know that there's the zealots are against the taxes being paid to Rome.
Yeah.
And he's putting some of the Jews against the other Jews and wanting Jesus to take sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is what they want to do.
Right. And all the more reason why you've got the Herodians with you, based on the question you're going to ask. Because they're the ones who would have the connections to be able to go back and say, did you guys hear what Jesus of Nazareth said about paying taxes that eventually funnel to Rome? And so the Herodians almost need to be there if they're really going to trap Jesus, because they're the ones that are going to have the right influences and connections to be able to go and tell the Roman rule what Jesus had said. And so I'm with you there.
Just go by the first part, I agree. It could be either way. When you go through the rest of it, but teach us the way of God and truth, they don't believe that.
Yeah, there's always a level of dishonesty about their approach that I don't think ever goes away. So they say to him, Master, we know that thou art true and carest for no man, for thou regardest not the person of men. By the way, all these things, whether they believed it or not, they are true. The statements are true either way. What they're saying about him is true, whether they believed it or not, or are using it to try to trap him or not, from that sense. But what they're saying is true, because he didn't. He didn't regard us any person. If it was from the high priest to the man he might encounter along the shore somewhere, they all received the same knowledge and same information, same level of truth. And no one was esteemed greater than another. No one was given any preferential kind of relationship to Jesus in that sense, and as it relates to truth. And so, very open and honest with them. Go ahead.
That statement, he cares for no man. Is that their opinion?
Well, I think that's just language, Jim. I think that's just, probably if you read that from a more modern translation, it would look a little different. It just means he doesn't respect one over another. That's all that means. He doesn't respect one over another. He cared for everybody. He's already evidenced that. And so that's difficult sometimes in English, but simply the idea that he doesn't respect one over another. He'll say the truth to anyone and everyone in the same fashion.
He's no respecter.
Yeah, right. And that becomes evident. Becomes evident in when he calls Peter to go to the Gentiles. That whole context illustrates that point. Okay. He's not overly influenced by any particular party or group, which actually has a greater implication in some ways to this moment. His answer is not going to be swayed simply because he's standing in front of Pharisees and Herodians. And maybe there's a sense of that here with their pre-question statement, in that they're basically saying to him, we know that you're going to tell the truth, even though we're the Pharisees and we're the Herodians, and we could get you in trouble for this, but we know you're going to tell us the truth anyway. And it ultimately does. So he says, you teach the way of God in truth, and then they ask their question. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Now, as was noted just a few moments ago, you've got varying opinions among the Jews about that. You have these Herodians who were trying to stay in the good graces of Rome, and so they obviously would be paying their tribute. You have some zealots among the Jews who believe it's an absolute atrocity that Rome is ruling over Judea, and that anything was leaving Judea to go back into the hands of the Caesars. And so they were adamantly opposed to the idea of sending money to Rome and paying taxes. We find that even among Jesus' apostles, right? Because you've got men who are tax collectors and men who are, or man who is a zealot. What does it mean? It means he was one of these folks who wanted complete disconnect from Rome. They'd even, when you look at the apostles, a person could quickly, if they knew anything about them, could quickly make the determination, Jesus is no respecter of persons. He's got guys from both sides of this issue walking with him. Okay? He's got men from both sides of this question walking with him. And so you might think, well, where's he going to go with this? Where's he going to go? Shall we give or shall we not give? But he, knowing, verse 15 there, hypocrisy. Okay? He knows the hypocrisy that is fueling this whole conversation. He knows that they're the kind of folks who would say one thing and go and do what? The exact opposite. In fact, there are occasions where Jesus basically says that about the Pharisees. He tells the audience, do what the Pharisees say or teach you because they know the law. Don't follow their example because they don't live it. And so their hypocrisy has been rampant and evident throughout the process. And so knowing this, he says, verse 15, why tempt ye me? Bring me a penny that I may see it. And they brought it, and he saith unto them, whose is this image and its superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. And so he basically says, bring me a coin. And they bring him a coin, and who's represented here on this coin? And their answer is, well, that's Caesar. Caesar is represented there on that coin. So Jesus says, verse 17, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And how'd they react? They marveled. In our modern vernacular, they would have said, great. What do we do now? What do we do now? We thought we had the perfect question, because if he says, send money to Caesar, just flat out, send it to him, then they'll go to the zealots and they'll say, did you hear what he just said? Why are you following him? Why would you believe anything that he says? Why would you entrust? If he says, no, don't pay any taxes, then they go over to the Herodians and all those folks and say, did you hear what he said about Rome? That we should. So their hypocrisy is evident. Their attempt is to try to get him to say it one way or the other, so they begin to divide. Great kind of sub-lesson here, by the way. Trouble often comes because people will come in and attempt to divide people on issues. Their effort is not to seek truth. Are these people really seeking truth? I think we've kind of concluded that they're not. There's a dishonesty here. Jesus points out their hypocrisy. Their purpose and intent is to drive a wedge between the believers in Jesus so they can shrink the multitude into parts so that there's not such a large-scale following. Then they can ultimately go and lay hands on him, which is what they said they wanted to do in verse 12. And so they know they've got to drive a wedge. My simple thought from that is, from an application standpoint, is be mindful of folks who are obviously trying to drive wedges. And what's their motivation? What's their end game? What are they really trying? And not just... Sure, we could have a long political discussion about that, and that's not really what I'm driving at. It happens in politics, but it happens among God's people too. It can happen among churches. It can happen. And so we need to be watchful and paying attention. Is somebody trying to drive a wedge, and why are they doing that? And what's the long-term purpose? Because that's exactly the method that the Jews were using to try to divide Jesus' followers and divide the multitude into kind of two groups, those who now trust Jesus and those who don't now. And fortunately, Jesus is wise enough to see through it. And he said, just give to Caesar what belongs to him and give God what belongs to God. there is a reason why Jesus is the master teacher. His wisdom in these moments, you think about it. If that were us, we'd be sitting there and we'd look on one side. We'd say, well, if I say that, and we'd start counting heads, right? Well, how many do I want to offend? And we try to figure out, right? Not Jesus. Jesus saw straight through it and gave an answer that is wise beyond measure. By just saying, just honor and give honor that's due to the right people when it's due them. And make sure you give God what's His.
The devil today is trying to do the same thing, to drive a wedge between the church and the world. He wants the world to control everything. That's what we got to watch out for.
Sure.
To pay tribute to Caesar, was that possibly a death sentence for the Roman government? Could it be?
And I think he's just talking here about paying your taxes. Or you're going to pay your tribute money. Is all it's under discussion. Just your tribute, your tax money is all it's under discussion here, I believe. Yeah.
They were vicious. The government was vicious.
Yeah. Those issues existed, but I think he's just talking here about do I send Caesar any of my money or not? Is really all that's happening in this scene. All right, Pharisees, Herodians, they come. they get an answer they weren't expecting. They're astonished. I think they're astonished in a couple of ways. They're astonished at the wisdom and prudence that Jesus uses in His answer, and they're astonished that they didn't what? They didn't have any success. They didn't do it. They were entrapped. Okay? They weren't successful in this. And so back to the drawing board. So who's the next group come? Here come the Sadducees. And another sect among the Jews. And one of their primary differences, if you will, there were more than this, but that one of their primary, especially biblically illustrated differences, is the Sadducees took issue with the resurrection. And I want you to notice, by the way, when we get into it, I'll preface it and we'll talk about it as we move through it. But they use what is a tactic that is still prominently used to challenge and place doubt in the minds of the believer. And I want you to watch how they do this as we move through it. He said, so these Sadducees come, which say there is no resurrection. And so they asked him, saying, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if a man's brother die and leave his wife behind him, and leave no children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. So they point to the Old Testament law. They say Moses said that if a man had a wife, they didn't have any children, that man's brother was to take her as his wife so that he could raise up children in his brother's stead, and there could be this lineage and continue on. Keep in mind, culturally, there was... I got to be careful here. Children are still a necessity and wonderful and all that. They were much different in those days, though. They were very much needed for survival. Okay? In modern times, you could survive, right? With that, it might not be as wonderful and benefiting, but whatever. But they needed children to survive. Her livelihood was going to be dependent upon having people and children around her to help care for her and take care of her. And so culturally, in Moses' day in particular, different, and even in their time. So this is the law. So based on that law, you can almost hear these guys sitting around having a conversation about how foolish it is for anyone to even contemplate the concept of a resurrection. And they would sit around and devise in their minds the illogical nature of believing in a resurrection. And to me, I could almost see them having used this illustration to kind of solidify in their minds why it is they don't believe in it. Because they say, okay, so you've got a guy, he knows the law, and so the brother takes her, and he dies, and they didn't have any children yet. So then the third brother comes along, and he takes her for his wife, and they don't have any children. And the 7 had her, verse 22, and left no seed. Last of all, the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, When they shall rise, whose wife shall she be of them? For the 7 had her to wife. Answer that one, Jesus. You believer in the resurrection, you preacher and teacher of the resurrection. Answer that question for us. How's that going to work out? When they all get up into and raised and end up in heaven, and here she is, and all these 7 brothers all had her for whose wife does she belong, or who does she belong to? And that kind of logic, if you will, that kind of argument continues to be used. When folks try to drive seeds of doubt into the minds of people, they will create unrealistic examples in order to try to prove some thought that they're issuing. The fact of the matter is, I don't know that they could have pointed to anybody they knew that actually fits this scenario, right? They've just created what they seem to be just a crazy circumstance now, that just how in the world is this going to be able to be dealt with in the resurrection? And let me backpedal for a moment and say to you, if we can read we've already read what Jesus says to him, right? So we kind of already know how he's going to react to that and how he's going to educate them about that. But I get it from a standpoint, if I didn't know much about what Jesus was going to teach or what he was going to say, I could see how that would go. How's that going to work? I can see the reason why they would use this tactic. I understand how that could create a challenge for folks and lay seeds of doubt about their belief in a resurrection. But here comes Jesus, the wise teacher, in verse 24, and he says unto them, do you not therefore err, because you know not the Scriptures, neither the power of God? And I don't know whether that last phrase of that verse hit me as much in the past as it did this go around when I was studying this text. What Jesus says is, number one, you really don't understand the resurrection, right? First of all, you err. Your concepts of the resurrection are not exactly as accurate according to what has been revealed concerning the resurrection. By the way, same problem today. We have the same issues often when it comes to eternity and it comes to the resurrection and it comes to those kinds of issues, because we have self-created what we believe those things should be and what they should look like. And then when the Bible kind of tells me something slightly different, then I want to almost call into question this whole concept. Jesus says, you be careful. You have created a mindset about the resurrection that is not accurately depicted within the Scriptures. And because of that, you may very well have laid seeds of doubt that were unnecessary. Number one, he says, maybe you need to go back and understand the Scriptures better. Number two, you don't understand the power of God. What you and I try to do is we try to simplify some things that cannot be simplified. We like things simple, right? I've spent a career of preaching on the simple because that's the only way I know how to do it. I'm not a very complicated person. We like the simple approaches to things. But when it comes to how we can be changed in the blink of an eye, when it comes to the idea of a bodily resurrection, yet into a different kind of body that can reside in eternity, when it comes to the concept of time ceases to exist, and now there's an eternal equation to this whole, that's complicated. And Jesus looks at them and says, you don't know the power of God. God handles the complicated. God handles the things that you and I in our finite minds cannot fully grasp. And so he says, don't underestimate how God can address this. Well, how's God going to address this? 4. when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. I'm just going to throw food for thought out there for you to think about. What I believe Jesus, now the simple mind is going to kick in, okay? Don't call me simple when you leave the building today, but that's kind of where I'm at. But what Jesus basically said is where their error was, is they took earth and put it in heaven. And Jesus says that's not how it works. They tried to take what they were familiar with and place it inside of the heavenly realm and say, well, that's what heaven must look like, right? And so then how in the world are we going to be able to take an earthly scenario where 7 brothers had the same wife, none of them were able to have children with her, and now they all get into heaven, and they're not going to know whose she going to live with? Whose mansion is she going to reside in? Because we've taken the earth and we've thrown it in heaven. Be careful. I try not to step on anybody's personal pictures, if you will, and things that bring comfort and that kind of thought. That's not what I'm trying to do. But what I am trying to do is just think about what Jesus just said. In heaven, they neither marry or are given in marriage. They are like the angels. They're like the angels. And so I don't know. I don't know how all that. That's where now I go back to the power of God. God understands how He can make all this work. How He can turn us into like the angels. How He can give us a place to abide and live in for eternity. And I'm just going to acknowledge that I don't fully understand all the power of God behind that, but I'm going to put my faith and confidences in Him that He can. But I'm also going to be careful that I don't overly attribute earthly things to heaven. Because the picture in the Bible really is more about we put aside the earth when we go into eternity. All the things that were difficult. And I think maybe that's where the challenges come sometimes in our mind is we say, oh, okay, we'll put all the bad stuff about the earth away, but we want all the good stuff of the earth to come with us. And again, I get it. I know why we do that. But Jesus handled this pretty wisely when He just tells them here, listen, you err. You've made a mistake on this. And the reason you have allowed yourselves to be in doubt about the resurrection is because you have thought about it too much in earthly terms. And you need to start thinking about the resurrection more in terms of the power of God and how He can bring us into angelic state. Let that sink in for a minute. To bring us into angelic state or condition and reside eternally with Him. It's an interesting picture. In the midst of this hypocritical, trapping kind of moment that they present. For as touching the dead, that they rise. Have you not read in the book of Moses how in the bush God spoke unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. Notice something about this that I want you to appreciate. He says to them, you guys want to look back to Moses? Let's look back to Moses. You want to go back to that Old Testament law? Okay, let's do that. Let's go back to Moses for a minute. And he says, do you remember what they said in the days of Moses about God? They called Him the what? The I am. Remember when Moses stands before the bush and he has that experience with God and Moses has several questions and concerns and tries to back out and all that kind of thing. But ultimately he has this question. He says, when I get there, who do I tell them sent me to lead them out of bondage? And God says to him, you tell them the I am has sent you. Not the I was, not the I will be. God just is. God is not the God of the was. He wasn't just was the God of Abraham, or was the God of Isaac, or was the God of Jacob. I am the God of Abraham. In other words, the implication, Abraham lives on. I am the God of Isaac. How? Because Isaac lives on. I am the God of Jacob. How? Because Jacob lives on. And unbeknownst to them all this time, they've been believers in that. There's no doubt in my mind that they had had opportunities over the generations to have quoted things like, I am the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. They just didn't appreciate what it actually meant. And so Jesus says, you've erred. You've greatly erred. Because you haven't grasped the very statements and truths that you've been espousing for generations. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You therefore do greatly err. Any thoughts or questions? I got about 3 or 4 minutes. Whether I can cover all the rest of this, we'll give it a shot. But I'll pause for a second.
Romans, he's referring to First Kings. Elijah was complaining, I'm the only prophet left. They have killed out all of the prophets. And God was telling me that I reserved the remnant. 700,000.
Yeah.
And they did not vow to fail. And that they was chosen not by their works, but by God's grace.
Yeah.
So God is in control. And you're not saying this.
Any other? Well, let's take a peek. We won't get all this done maybe in 2.5 minutes. But so kind of, while this is kind of ending, this scene's kind of, they've kind of had their opportunity to try to trap him. And so while that's going on, one of the scribes comes, and having heard them reasoning together, so there's this conversation between the Sadducees and Jesus. So he's kind of privy to that. And perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all? Who's the best basketball player who's ever played on a basketball court? Right? If you grew up in my era, you're going to say Michael Jordan. You're not going to say, no, I'm older, I'm younger than that. But Larry Bird, maybe, but not really. But if you're older, you might say somebody like Jerry West, or you might talk about one of those old time guys, right? Depending on your perspective, you would answer who's the best differently. You want to trap somebody and try to catch them in a problem? Get them to tell you who's the best about something, and then watch the fireworks that come by the people who disagree with that. That's what they're trying to do. They've come to Jesus. The scribe has potentially witnessed the failure of the Pharisees and Herodians. He's now witnessed the failure of the Sadducees. So he's got, I get it. I'll get him to name the most important command, and there's got to be dozens and dozens of Jews who'll disagree with him. And that's going to fail here in a minute as well. All right, Lord willing, we'll come back Wednesday. I'll finish this narrative. We'll answer the questions concerning chapter 12, then we'll move forward.